we go.
Cool. Well, thanks for the introduction. As Kevin said, I am a principal software engineer at Liberty Mutual Insurance. Today, I'm going to be talking a bit about AWS SAM, and I'm also going to kind of kick it off with kind of a little bit more of an in-depth intro of some of the work that I've been doing with women in technology too. So kind of a two-in-one. So just a quick agenda. I'll do an introduction more on myself, so everybody knows who I am. I'll talk about my woman in tech work. We'll jump into the current state of serverless at Liberty Mutual. I'm going to define what SAM is. So if it's totally new to you, that's totally fine. If it isn't, and you're a seasoned SAM expert, you can definitely feel free to tune me out for a couple minutes there. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing with SAM at Liberty Mutual for some pattern development, some of the best practices we've been following, some of the things that are coming up next for us, and then I'll leave some time at the end for Q&A, but I will also do my best to pay attention to the chat and pause here and there if folks have questions throughout. So I like to keep the webinars in smaller groups pretty informal, so feel free to chime in or post something in the chat. So if you haven't heard of us, Liberty Mutual is an insurance company. We exist to help people embrace today and confidently pursue tomorrow. We do that by promising protection for the unexpected delivered with care. We are the 6th largest global property and casualty insurer, and we're in just about 30 countries and economies worldwide. So we have about 45,000 employees, and actually roughly 5,000 of those sit in technology-related roles. So we like to joke as a company that we are a tech company that happens to sell insurance. We also rank on the Fortune 100 list, and we have close to a 45 billion annual consolidated revenue. So we're definitely large, we're corporate, and we have been around for a long time. I think we're about to hit our 110th anniversary. So we've definitely won some awards these past couple years. Some of these are a little out of date. I know that we've also gotten the best places to work in IT for 2022 as well. And we're also pretty well known for our diversity and inclusion efforts. So we've been voted one of the best places to work for women, diversity, for new grads, LGBTQ equality. And we've even achieved a perfect score of 100 in the Human Rights Campaign's Corporate Equality Index these last several years. So if this is interesting to you at all, we're always hiring. You can check us out at lmi.co/tech, or feel free to reach out to me as well. I actually work a lot with our recruiters and I do a lot of the interviewing as well. So definitely would be happy to help out on that front. So a little bit more about me. As I mentioned, I'm a principal software engineer at Liberty Mutual. I work specifically on our serverless DevOps and enablement team. So my focus is to work with our 5,000 or so developers and help them reach the cloud in a serverless first fashion. I've been here for about 4 years plus a 1-year internship. I've done a couple different things in that time. So I've been in the serverless space for about 2.5 years now. But prior to that, I was working a bit with Java and microservices, doing a little bit of front end work, doing a little bit of image recognition work. So I dipped my toes in a couple different things, but I've really been enjoying the serverless space so far. I was just announced about 2 weeks ago now as a new serverless hero for AWS. So that's super exciting. And I was formerly a builder in the serverless cohort as of this past March as well. I do have my master's in electrical and computer engineering. I focused a lot on IoT, cloud computing, and some robotics. I like to joke that the robotics side is kind of my guilty pleasure interest. So I poorly timed that and got that while the pandemic was happening through Boston University while I was working full time. So not something I recommend, but it definitely worked out for me. I actually live just outside of Boulder, Colorado in Erie. I have just started up the Serverless Denver group. So we have our second meetup actually in almost exactly 2 weeks, taking place at the AWS office in Denver. So feel free to reach out about that. We also have our Meetup group and a Twitter page. So if you're interested, definitely check that out. We're always looking for people to attend, to sponsor, to host a venue. Definitely open to chatting about that as well. I'm also a very active member of the Women Who Code Denver Boulder group. And we also meet for monthly webinars and have Slack spaces and do events and run conferences and fun things like that. So I'll talk a little bit more about that actually in my next slide, or the one after that. So in terms of the women in tech work that I've been doing, it's kind of split into two tracks. So we have a very active internal women in tech group and like women empowering group, both inside of Liberty, and I'm also very involved externally. So the things on this slide I'm going to speak to are to the internal work that I'm doing. So we have a employee resource group for women in tech, and we have a couple different work streams that are a part of that. And I've done a lot of work with both of these. So the first is kind of a fun acronym. It's LEGIT, and it stands for Liberty Encouraging Girls in Technology. So we've been around for about 7 years now. And we're around to teach simple coding and inspire young girls to pursue STEM education. So we've recently reorged and kind of split off into different groups. We used to be very location and chapter based. So we would host different events out of Boston, Seattle, New Hampshire, even out of our Ireland office as well. And we'd have Liberty volunteers teach and work with students one-on-one or in small groups. So we do hour of code activities. We work with like little micro bits. We do some resume workshops and some like mock interviews. So we work with everywhere from K through 12 students across Boys and Girls Clubs, Girl Scouts, YMCA. So it's really cool. Currently, I'm actually heading up our external branding and communications. So I'm working to create some marketing materials, kind of get the word out about us externally, work with students and teachers and build relationships with partners and put together newsletters and all of that fun stuff. So if it's something that you might be interested in, if you have kids in schools nearby, definitely let me know. We're very happy to create new partnerships and to work with others and do both in-person and remote activities. Additionally, we also have a Women in Tech Summit mentorship. So every year, actually it's next week, we run a summit for women who are in their freshman or sophomore year in college. And they usually come to our campus. This might actually be the first year we're back in person again. We were running it virtually these past couple of years. And we have them come in and just kind of talk really openly and honestly about their experiences early on in their college education for engineering, IT roles, anything in the computer science or engineering realm. And we talk about it and build up networks. So we also have folks that volunteer from Liberty Mutual to work one-on-one with them throughout the year. Usually just set up like monthly coffee chats, check in, see how things are going, help them out with interview processes, whether it's at Liberty or not, and just kind of serve as another female mentor kind of in the technology profession. So some cool stuff going on there. We usually have a lot going on. These are kind of our two main things. And I've been fortunate enough to be able to keep things going throughout the pandemic. So excited to see what the next year or so brings.
Hey, Kristi, quick question for you.
Sure.
For people that are interested in kind of helping out, being an ally for the cause, are there opportunities? You mentioned, for example, mock interviews. Could people sign up to help do mock interviews or something like that? How could someone help out with the community here?
Yeah, sure. And I'll speak a little bit more to that on this slide as well. In terms of our partnership with Liberty Mutual, I think that we do allow some volunteers, especially if you're parents that have students in that school system or working with that student group that we're working with. And typically, I think recently we've done story time too. So we pick a STEM related book for some of the younger kids and we have people volunteer to read to them as well. So there's definitely some opportunities there. I would say maybe a little bit more associated with external work. So a couple of things here and a couple of maybe suggestions or things that might help folks out. So actually back in January, I wrote an article on how to support women in tech. It ended up getting a little bit bigger than I thought, and it got picked up by Insider Magazine, or Insider, Business Insider, Tech Insider. So it was posted back in January. I threw a screenshot of the original Medium link in here, but I basically broke that article down into a couple of different sections on how to better support women in tech and some of the things that you can do. Because as Kevin perfectly demonstrated, I get that question a lot, and I thought it would be great to consolidate that into an article. So if you want to check that out, I will send along a link for that. I mentioned on my earlier slide that I'm part of the Women Who Code Colorado group. We also have chapters kind of all around the country and actually globally as well. So you can also get involved in Women Who Code Cloud, Women Who Code Python. There's like a Women Who Code mobile group. So they're location-based and also kind of topic and interest-based. I will clarify that these are open to anyone. It's not just women in tech. We happily support allies and things. The best way to get involved is to reach out to the group that you're most interested in, and you can get added to the Slack channels. And we're pretty good about meeting at least on a monthly cadence. Sometimes we have tech topic series. We're looking for people to speak all the time and just knowledge share. We also do like conferences. And we have folks that sign up to kind of review proposals and be on some of the committees there. So there's some opportunities there as well. There's also job boards and postings for that too. So if you're looking to kind of diversify your workforce as well, that's another avenue to kind of reach out to and check with for other speaking engagements or events or for jobs. I like to speak a lot. I do a lot of things like this. I do also with specific women in tech groups. Actually, in mid-July, I will be moderating a panel on the importance of allyship at the Women Impact Tech Denver conference. I also recently sat on a panel out of the user group in Wales to talk about women in tech and some of our journeys as part of the International Women's Day in March. So there's lots of opportunities there that I've been involved with and kind of spreading the word and just encouraging more folks to speak. Actually kind of interesting. I posted a recap of some of my most recent speaking engagements and shared some of the struggles of it not being very diverse within my company. And I actually had a couple other women reach out and asked about how to get started and how they can start speaking. So I'm super excited about that. And that's definitely one of the reasons why I do a lot of these things. And that kind of goes along with the mentorship and coffee chats and things. So I have a lot of those usually set up on my calendar. I tend to mentor at least 1 or 2 interns over the summer, as well as some of those folks from the WIT Summit, and then just folks in the community will reach out. And I always make sure that my calendar is available for those folks. And just in general, supporting others. Sometimes it's as simple as a reshare on Twitter or on LinkedIn for somebody's post. It's attending things like this for speaking events and just providing support in any means necessary for some of our folks in the minority groups and tech. That was a lot. Any questions on any of the women in tech stuff, any of the work there, anything about getting involved? Cool. Okay. If you think of anything, feel free to reach out or ask me a question at the end. With that, I'll jump into some of our serverless stuff and we'll talk about SAM a little bit here. So just to kind of preface this, I do want to dive a little bit into our current state of serverless at Liberty Mutual. So as I mentioned earlier, we're a very large company, we're a very old company, but we have come pretty far in the serverless space. We currently have a centralized sort of catalog for patterns and for development. These are starter patterns, or externally, I've heard the term a lot, golden paths, which is actually coined by Spotify. And it's literally like, the definition of it's literally like a best practices path of doing stuff. So it's very ambiguous, very vague. We've kind of taken that and coined it into the term patterns. And it's a great way for our developers to get started really easily, really quickly. It lowers the bar to entry for serverless and gets folks started within our pipelines, within our security best practices, and within the well-architected framework. This has really led to a rapid community adoption within Liberty Mutual for serverless with these well thought out patterns, and this good place to start. It's really kind of pushed the needle on this and has led to a lot of rallying support, a lot of knowledge sharing, and a pretty robust serverless community. And in fact, if you didn't see or you missed it, we were actually recognized on stage as part of the CTO's keynote this past year at this last reInvent, talking about this exact topic and our pattern development and our developer experience. A little bit specifically with serverless, but this is also not just serverless specific. It's kind of throughout all of our AWS services or other non-AWS kind of pathways too. So what is SAM? I'm not sure how many folks are that familiar with SAM. You may have worked with it a lot. You may just have heard of it. So SAM is the AWS Serverless Application Model. It's an open source framework used to define your infrastructure in YAML. So your Lambda functions, your S3 buckets, your Dynamo table, you can define those resources in your code with YAML. It is a CloudFormation extension, meaning that this will still sync into a regular old CloudFormation template. However, one of the key differences is that you're going to use this serverless property type for some of your functions and your resources. And it simplifies the YAML file just a little bit to kind of shorten up what you have. You also get some added benefits with the SAM CLI, which I'll go into, and some other resources to take advantage of when using SAM. So this is just a quick example. On the left is a Lambda function that you define in CloudFormation, and on the right is a very similar function that you would put together in SAM. The key difference here is really that type. So on the left, you'll see in CloudFormation, it's a Lambda function, and in SAM, it's actually called a serverless function. It can be a little bit more shorthand. They are slightly different functions that I'm comparing here just to kind of show. You still call out your handler, your runtime you want to use, and some of those other configuration elements. In some cases, it is just a shorter hand version of a Lambda function. So you can use this in a number of different ways. Obviously, first and foremost, it's perfect for building serverless apps. So if you have a full stack serverless application, SAM's great for that. It's also built for event-driven architecture. And the kind of three key elements that have that serverless tag are serverless functions, serverless APIs, and serverless simple tables, which simple tables are just Dynamo tables, API is your API gateway, and functions are just your Lambda functions. In some cases, we found that folks really like using YAML over code. Kind of one important key element here in kind of explaining why we might use SAM a lot is we actually don't allow our developers to have write access in our console. Everything that's provisioned needs to be provisioned through a pipeline. So because of that, we are kind of forced into using these IAC tools. So SAM is one, and CDK is obviously very popular. We're mostly an AWS shop, so we tend to stick to the AWS tools. However, we do have folks that preference Serverless Framework or Terraform or some of the other tools out there. But I'd say we're probably heaviest CDK, and maybe a close second would be kind of SAM and CloudFormation templates. So one of the cool things about SAM is that you can take advantage of the SAM CLI. So these are not all the commands, and I won't dive into complete detail in all of them, but it allows you to interact with your code through the CLI. So you can do a SAM init and create a hello world SAM setup project right out of the box. You can run a SAM build to build your project locally. You can also test locally using SAM local invoke for your Lambda functions. A SAM deploy will deploy your application. SAM validate will validate your template, and a sync will also synthesize your template as well. So these are all great commands that you can take advantage of, really helpful in local testing, really quick, easy to do, pretty self-explanatory. Again, these aren't all of them, but probably some of the most popular ones, some of the ones that I would probably use on a daily basis when I'm in our SAM projects. So from SAM init, you'll get this sample kind of application. There's a bunch of different templates you can actually look into on the AWS documentation website. This one, I believe, is just a hello world SAM init right out of the box. So you'll get your README file, you'll get an event file, and then you have your app.py and your template.yaml. So that's kind of the key piece that's a little different than a CloudFormation project. Your template.yaml will look something like this on the right. So you'll just have your serverless function from that original example. This is actually, I think, the whole template inside of this code. So as you can see, it's very basic, very easy to get a function kind of out there pretty quickly, and hello world. So I could talk probably for an entire presentation about SAM. I know that there are a lot of SAM experts out there who definitely just have full hour-long talks about what SAM is and the cool things you can do with it. I won't go completely down that road, but there's a ton of different resources out there. The AWS documentation is a pretty good place to start. There is a Tech Talks on YouTube that goes through how to get started with SAM. Serverless Land is another great space to use. There's some office hours, there's some workshops, there's some articles, there's some things you can go through there to get started. And as I mentioned, this is an open source tool, so you can check out the SAM GitHub repo and also contribute. So specifically, how are we using SAM at Liberty Mutual? So we've kind of identified like 3 key users that are working with SAM. So first, I like to point our cloud beginners to SAM. It's not completely necessary to know CloudFormation before jumping into something like CDK. However, we have found in the past that knowing how to structure your projects and resources in YAML is a little bit easier when you're first getting started, and helps you kind of understand resource configuration and kind of what goes into it before jumping straight into CDK. So I do like to point some of our cloud beginners to the SAM templates, just because I think that it's a little bit easier to kind of wrap your head around. Obviously, anybody who's developing in serverless, sometimes people just preference SAM. Kind of goes hand in hand with the second one, is kind of with our YAML users. So some folks prefer to define their infrastructure as code in a language like Python or TypeScript. However, there's definitely people that still really like the YAML configuration. I found a lot of those folks tend to come from an ops background, maybe former DBAs or network admins that have all kind of retooled to be full stack developers or application developers. So a lot of them are more familiar with or more comfortable with using YAML. So it's a totally acceptable choice, and we definitely have folks that preference SAM because of that. So as I mentioned, there's a SAM init command that gets you started kind of right out of the box. So why do we need a specific process for working with SAM at Liberty Mutual? So it does work out of the box. It's just not as easy as it could be for our developers. So this is where that centralized catalog and those patterns come into play at the very beginning. So we do have sort of this centralized catalog where developers can go and pick out a starter pattern. They can search by, what kind of tools they want to use, or what kind of tech, what kind of language they want to be in, what resources they want to generate. And these patterns are all contributed from our community. So some folks like my team, we own a couple of these patterns and kind of kickstart some of the space. And then we let the community run with it and kind of see where they identify a lot of repeat use, a lot of repeat patterns, something that they can contribute back that they think that other developers at Liberty Mutual would find valuable or would use. So obviously this is promoting a lot of collaboration, a lot of reuse, and a lot of knowledge sharing. It's developed a lot of different Slack and Teams channels, communication threads for folks to kind of reach out and ask questions and really learn from each other, which is awesome to see. So the contribution model that we kind of follow to put something into this catalog would be to first ask, is this going to benefit someone else? Is what I'm building a really standard pattern that I think a lot of people are going to use? Even if it's just your own team, maybe you just have to kind of repeat the same process over and over again for something that you're managing. You're breaking out a monolith application into microservices. Maybe you're modernizing some apps and you have a lot of the same structures. So it's recognizing whether or not that's going to benefit you more in the future or someone else. You can check the catalog, see if it's something that already exists. And if it doesn't, you would engage with our platform team that owns this kind of catalog process and these patterns. You would develop exactly what you want to through their contribution model. And then you'd own and maintain this going forward. So you don't have to worry about the catalog or the platform. You just have to make sure that your pattern is staying up to date, you're fixing bugs, and maintaining it going forward. So for instance, our team owns what we call the SAM skeleton pattern. So this gives you a Python Lambda out of the box. We actually use this really cool tool called Cookie Cutter that will take your dynamic input from the user and put that into the structure of the project. So we'll give you a Python Lambda out of the box, but we're going to ask you a couple questions like maybe what you want to name your project, maybe if you want a storage solution, and then we'll ask if you want S3 or Dynamo also included. We'll ask if you want an API gateway with authorization. So we'll have you go through this process of answering these questions. And the really unique thing about it is it gets you set up with all of our enterprise tooling out of the box. This is especially important to follow our CI/CD kind of pipeline process. So we have some checks and SPIs and things built into our pipeline process for security purposes. This kind of ties into some cloud tech debt as well. Just kind of checks to make sure things like certain permissions or policies are attached to your resources, like bucket policies, IAM roles, and users. We'll also do things like checking to make sure that you aren't on a runtime that's deprecated or soon to be deprecated. So some of those kinds of things are built into this pattern. So that's not something that you'll get straight from a SAM init command, but you'll need it to deploy through our pipelines. I will call out, it's actually our only SAM offering at the moment. I think it's been used, I want to say cloned down about 100 to 150 times. So we can tell kind of some metrics around that and see how popular that something like this is. So this is kind of just what it looks like. These are some of the questions we'll ask. Extra iterations, another one I didn't mention. You can put in a description, you can select your data persistence, and then you'll get these commands out of the box. So if you select a Dynamo table, you're going to get this top YAML file for a simple table. We'll put in as much as we can, but obviously with some security and stuff, you'll have to go in and put in some of your keys. We'll also provision like an S3 bucket if you ask for it. So we'll set up your logging configuration, some of those things out of the box that you won't necessarily get with a SAM init, but you do need out of the box for Liberty Mutual. So I've touched on this a little bit, but just to kind of go in a little bit more depth here, constraints, and this is the well-architected review process, not war. So as I mentioned, we do have several security rules, and that's the importance of building out these patterns with some of these things in place. That's why we can't just say go out and pick a open source SAM workshop out of the box and you'll be in the cloud. That is really frustrating for a lot of our developers and kind of a pain point because they try to do that and then they hit 10 different walls that they have to jump through, tons of hoops to jump through to kind of get through our process and to actually deploy. And then they get frustrated because it's not an easy process, but we want to make sure we're still being secure. So it's kind of that walking that fine line of making sure that folks can still be innovative. It's easy for them to get started, but they're doing it securely and through best practices. As I mentioned, we don't have write access. Our account structure has grown very substantially over time. So for most teams, everyone shares like an AWS Sandbox account. That's kind of like a free for all. You can go in, you can play with things. It's not really locked down. Kind of POC projects, try out different services. You don't have to go through the pipelines for that. But everything else from your develop, test, non-prod staging all the way up through production, you will not have access to. You do have some read-only access in your lower level environments, but otherwise you need to go through these pipelines. We also utilize what we call pipeline patterns. We use the Bamboo suite of tools. So this is Bamboo specs. So again, we have a centralized team that kind of maintains these, and you contribute your own pipelines going forward or patterns going forward for your pipeline. So like we've defined a SAM build and a SAM deploy pipeline patterns. We've also defined CDK builds and CDK deploys for both version 1 and version 2, so that folks don't need to worry about some of those controls. And they'll also get those things out of the box with their patterns, so they don't have to worry about setting up the pipeline and what kind of script tasks they're using or anything like that. We also want to make sure that folks are following well-architected best practices right out of the box. So if you don't know, there are 6 pillars to the well-architected reviews: operational excellence, security, reliability, performance efficiency, cost optimization, and sustainability. I'm actually super excited about this. The well-architected thing is our next kind of big focus for our team, something I'm hoping to talk about a little bit more in the future. But we are actually looking at building out a dashboard of sorts and also an API along with it that will show teams an individualized view of some of how they stack up against these pillars, give them some recommendations on how to fix them. And as part of that, we'll be implementing a check with these catalog patterns so that they will be identified whether or not they're following best practices out of the box. And we'll allow for a rating system with our community so that the ones with the best practices will float to the top and we'll utilize those the most. So some more next steps. I did mention the well-architected piece. Future state I'm kind of seeing for SAM. We've definitely talked a lot on our team about offering a TypeScript out of the box. TypeScript's actually our #1 language at Liberty Mutual that we use for serverless development. So we'd love to put in an offering for that if we find some demand for it. We want to continue encouraging the SAM pattern development. So our pattern is out there. Like I said, I think it's around 100 or 150 clones of that or patterns have been generated from this pattern. So we want to continue encouraging folks to utilize SAM as it fits their use cases. And there's always going to be kind of this SAM versus CFT versus CDK conversation going on. I'd even add to that for serverless framework, for Terraform, for some of the other tools. Our kind of suggestion continues to be going forward, use whatever tool works best for your team, what fits you and what your team is working with, maybe your skill set, maybe something that you might want to learn. But it still remains kind of one of our bigger players in the space, and we'll definitely still be supporting it for the future. So that's pretty much all I had tonight. I have thrown my Twitter handle up here as well as my LinkedIn. If anybody wants to follow me, reach out to me. I'm also happy to share the Serverless Denver meetup. And I think that's it. Any questions? Anything anybody wants to talk about?
I'm curious about your pipeline solution. Is that something that's very custom to Liberty Mutual, or is it something that's built on top of another solution?
Sure. So I can't talk too much about it because of proprietary reasons. But yeah, so we support Bamboo pipelines right now. And we also have a Jenkins workflow, but we're mostly kind of on the Bamboo side for our pipelines. We're in the early stages of assessing GitHub Actions, which I'm very excited about. But for now, we do have, so my team runs serverless development specifically. We do have like an AWS governance team, and they own a lot of SPIs and plugins that we have developed kind of internally to do a lot of these checks within the pipelines. So like those security checks, that's like a Java Spring Boot project that started several years ago, checks all services, not just serverless ones, for some of these things. And then the Bamboo specs as well. That's another library that has been created internally and is managed internally for folks to, as part of building out exactly what tasks and which things you're going to go through for the pipeline. So like that SAM deploy and the CDK deploy, like we build those into script tasks within those pipeline patterns so that folks don't have to worry about those things when they're pushing up or building.
Interesting, thanks.
Yeah.
I've got a question, Kristi. The golden path model, I've heard of that, quite a bit. Netflix was a big advocator of that as well. So
Yep.
when you all pulled in the SAM framework into the golden path, did you get a lot of resistance being, an established IT shop, and how did you, go about getting that incorporated into the tool chain, if you will, for Liberty Mutual? Did you see a lot of, pushback, or what was that experience like?
Yeah, there hasn't been too much pushback. I think because we really promote this like centralized catalog of offerings, like the community is really open to just like having a bunch of different options there. And then we just kind of support and follow, where the community tends to head towards. That's actually mostly been CDK, hence why we haven't actually put out like a TypeScript offering for SAM yet, because we haven't heard of too many asks for it. And actually, funny enough, we had more asks for Python because we have a internal like infrastructure academy, and they're teaching them all coming out with Python. So they were like, well, we want to see more Python patterns in this catalog because that's what we're learning when we're coming out of this program. So it's kind of like cool insights like that, where you get to see exactly what's driving the community and it directly drives your product backlog. So we don't get pushback necessarily, but we do see more where folks are headed.
Awesome. Yeah. So along with that, as you started to try to drive adoption, did you use the Infrastructure Academy? What was like the mechanism to kind of advocate for SAM, the technology, and also kind of bring the development workforce up to speed to where they could, operate with the framework in a, production ready manner?
Yep. So some of that is just innately having the patterns out there. Folks are like, oh, I want to get started with serverless. They just search for serverless in the catalog search bar, and that's going to be one of the tools that comes up. And then there's a lot of documentation surrounding it, right? So we'll have a long description of what exactly it is, exactly what it's going to give you out of the box, what languages we're going to support for you. And then we'll even link out to all the external like AWS documentation, workshops, all of that kind of thing, so that we can let the developer make an informed decision based on those things. And then alongside that, whenever we release a new pattern or we're supporting a new tool, we have like an internal blogging site, as well as like Slack and Teams and stuff. So we'll kind of do a big communication blast as well, to get folks out there. So, and for the most part, most folks know that there is a serverless DevOps team now. So people will reach out to us directly too and kind of ask for our opinion. We've also been known to kind of consult one-on-one with teams. We do some of these patterns. We do the consulting. We do some work with Well Architected. We build some of those security rules ourselves. So we kind of jump from thing to thing depending on where the need is.
Awesome. Yeah, cool. Love the approach of letting the development teams pick their technology, what's the right technology for their solution, and, it's kind of guiding them. So yeah, thank you for that. Very insightful.
Yeah, definitely. I see there's a question in the chat for the contribution model. How do you manage downstream updates? Like you update your template to be more secure. Do you force the update down, or are the teams simply alerted and they need to plan updates? So typically, yeah, that's a good question. So like if you built a project or used the pattern, and then like a month later, a security update came out, or, we updated from a deprecated runtime, we just communicate those things out, and then kind of push that communication via like that internal blogging site, as well as the Slack and the Teams communication channels, and then expect the developer to maintain that going forward. And part of that, and actually sometimes what we tend to do is we reach out to the teams that own the patterns first so they can get ahead of it, and we turn around and say like, hey, we're going to stop supporting this in 2 weeks, or hey, we know that a perfect example right now, Python 3.6 has announced deprecation, so we're jumping on our pattern teams that have these first, to make sure that they update their patterns. And when that official announcement comes out and the end date comes out, the patterns are already up to date, and then we can just focus on reaching out to the teams that we see have deprecated runtimes. And actually that brings up a good point. One of the other processes my team owns is actually going out to all of our accounts, which are a couple hundred, and gathering Lambda and API configuration metrics, so we can actually see what those are. And like one of the security rules is kind of tagging standards to make sure that we know who owns things, what cost centers they roll up to, and that sort of thing. So we can actually pull a report and see that there's, I think right now we pulled for Python 3.6, I think there's like 3,500 Lambda functions out there with Python 3.6, but we'll know exactly who to reach out to, exactly who to bother. what accounts are affected the most and that sort of thing. So we can start reaching out now. So we do have some insight and some metrics into that.
Nice. Any more questions? Okay, I do have one final question unrelated to the tech. Is that the Black Canyon of the Gunnison in your?
It is.
That place is beautiful. That's amazing.
Yeah, sometimes when there's a fun fact in these, that's my question. You know, like if there's like a question that people ask for prize or whatever, that's what I usually like to ask. It is. I went actually almost a year ago. Last July I was there. Absolutely beautiful. Very underrated.
Yeah, I think it's definitely underrated. Probably underpublicized, really. You know, everyone talks about Rocky Mountain National Park or the sand dunes. But cool. Yeah, beautiful picture. Okay, well, cool. Thank you so much, Kristi. This has been a great session, great talk. Really appreciate you taking the time to drop some knowledge on us. So we're going to go ahead and wrap up, and we'll get the recording set up, and we'll go ahead and put a link to that on the Meetup event when we get that uploaded.